Hi, this is Lex, and welcome to the FinTech Blueprint. It's your podcast about fintech, decentralized finance, digital banking, investing, robo-advice, artificial intelligence, and all the other frontier technology that is transforming financial services. To get more content, like an illustrated transcript of this conversation in your inbox, subscribe at fintechblueprint.com. Today's podcast is a collaboration with Consensus, the market-leading blockchain technology company. Given its core position in the Ethereum ecosystem, we're able to bring you the most captivating industry insiders, from technologists and entrepreneurs to designers and creatives from all around the world. So join us for inspiring conversations on the future of finance, crypto, and what is making up the new decentralized web. So without further delay, let's jump into today's episode. Hi, everybody. I am really excited for today's podcast, where we are going to learn and explore the frontier of Web3 and decentralized autonomous organizations. We have with us Nicholas, who is an NFT developer and a contributor to Juicebox, which is an awesome DAO enablement software, as well as SharkDAO and PartyDAO. He is very active in the ecosystem. He's got a Solidity podcast called Solidity Galaxy Brain, a collaborator with multiple NFT artists, but I could go on and on. Let me welcome Nicholas to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. I'm really psyched actually for today's conversation. But before we get into the meat of it, can you tell us a little bit about your journey into Web3 and I guess more broadly the crypto ecosystem?
Yeah, absolutely. I really came into the scene. I'd been observing Ethereum and known its potential for a long time. But I think earlier in its history, I felt it was a little bit sort of pre-DeFi summer. It seemed very mathematical and a little bit out of my personal reach or where my personal sensibilities were, which were really in researching social networks and what through a graduate research project I came to call network organisms. This umbrella term I use to describe anything that thrives and succeeds on the network. So in some graduate research that I did, I wrote a lot about the performance art of launching these network organisms, which could be anything ranging from an Apple Incorporated to Wikipedia or ultimately some of these crypto projects. And so a lot of those learnings that I made during that research project ended up being really applicable as I finished up that research project. I had also at the time been co-directing a digital fabrication lab based in a community center in Montreal. And just as I finished up that research project and was starting to look for something new, my head was sort of at, do I want to go to California? I had long resisted working for the FANG kind of companies or whatever the new acronym is with Meta. Manga, I heard somebody say.
I don't know if you can say it out loud because it just, it invokes them. They just appear.
Voldemort style. Yeah, so I basically started paying attention to NFTs really naturally as that project came to a close. And it was sort of the beginning of the boom season for NFTs at the end of 2020. And in the fall, I started paying a lot of attention. And I remember I had this shower thought as I discovered NFTs, which I'd heard about previously, but was sort of dissuaded from getting into by a friend who told me in the CryptoKitties era in 2017, 2018, that NFTs were not a big deal because ultimately all you owned was some reference to some off-chain dependency through IPFS, which was true to an extent. I'd sort of not paid too much attention because of that sort of negative take I heard early on. And then in late 2020, I started spending time diving in personally, and it just became very clear to me in the shower. I remember having this one thought that I imagined PewDiePie saying on an episode of his daily vlog, post your Ethereum address in the comments below, and I'll give an NFT to one lucky person at the end of tomorrow's episode, something like this. And that's just sort of symbolized my feeling that for creators online, NFTs would be really a no-brainer, like quite low cost, essentially no inventory problem solution to layer in as a revenue stream or contest award or so many other applications you could imagine for people who really make their bread by filming themselves or recording podcasts, et cetera. It just seemed like such a natural fit for these people outside of the domain of the often really high tax rate platforms, especially if you look at things like Roblox. There are some platforms out there that will make Apple's 30% tax look affordable. I think that if you're a fashion designer in Roblox, I think it can be as high as 60, 70, or 80% cut the platform takes. So especially when you start thinking about 3D come to be called metaverses, like what Roblox is a sort of a proto form of, it just makes sense that we'll need some kind of infrastructure that's different. And I believe there's actually a story about Vitalik getting involved in coming up with Ethereum because he lost his World of Warcraft loot originally. I'd have to confirm the story, but obviously there was just a lot of compatibility between the things that I was doing in this digital fabrication lab and in my research work, thinking about the performance art of launching these networks, and also in the fabrication lab working with professional artists who were creating works using laser cutters and 3D printers and such, and shipping them around the world. And then coming into a digital space where people will often make these parallels to like the birth of the web in the 90s, but it took several years from the point where Mosaic was released, a visual browser for the web, to the invention of, I think it Wired, the banner ad. And yet in the Ethereum space and in Web3 more broadly, the proclivity or affordances to create business models are built right into the initial spec. So it just seemed really obvious that this would move at a faster pace than what we had seen with the web when I was much younger, too young to be involved. And so that really was how I got involved.
That's awesome. Your answer is so dense with reference that's really interesting. And so I want to just pause on a couple of things that I think people will really benefit from understanding better. So, the first point around the research that you talk about the performative aspect of launching a network organism. I think that's a really it's a powerful analogy, but it's also really interesting phrasing, because the shape of internet communities is its own superorganism, and it's now quantifiable. We see the behavior and the tendencies essentially of flocks of people, and then this expresses itself in various ways in capital markets. It expresses itself in the price of crypto assets as well as the price of GameStop. And so I'd love to unpack a little bit what you mean by that. And then I think the second thing that we should pause a little bit on is this idea of people who make their living by performing or engaging with a camera, right? And this kind of is a reference to the creator economy and the idea that we've got this whole almost orthogonal media industry and way of living that people have that is now moving into digital assets and digital objects. So do you mind riffing on those two things a little bit?
Absolutely. Yeah. In the research that I did, I guess really what I wanted to drill down on was some aspects of what I came to call abstraction fashion. I really feel like what we do when we work in the computational arts, let's say, can often be characterized as, we use verbs like writing code, because the abstraction we use to deal with code, at least most of the time, is text. But of course, there's nothing about a Turing machine or virtual machine, any of the fundamental abstractions of computation, that is necessarily text oriented. It's just the design language around programming that we found most useful up to this point. Previously it was punch cards, and in the future maybe it'll be some visual modular system, or even something implicit in a voice command that will dispatch some programming labor. So what I wanted to discuss in my research paper, it was a master's dissertation, was sort of what is it that connects things like, Elon Musk wrapping a roofing torch in an airsoft gun and calling it a flamethrower, and, exploring space or creating a 3D network of tunnels under the earth. Like there's something going on in what we all respect from these characters like Elon or Kanye or Kim Kardashian or many others. And sometimes we like them and sometimes we don't. But regardless, what their skill to me is performing and creating a context in which others can gather around them and their vision and be excited in order to sort of collectively constitute a network organism. If a company or a nonprofit or whatever it may be, or an open source project, doesn't achieve the traction socially or financially to be able to either incentivize people by their own volition, their own will, or by financial compensation, then it really won't survive the long run, because fundamentally software on the network requires continued work and labor. It's an enduring performance where we must constantly update, for the most part, our software in order to be relevant and compatible with the changing affordances of the network around it. Almost from an ecological perspective, if a piece of software doesn't get updated by somebody, most likely it will fall into disrepair. And maybe the exception to that rule that comes to mind is something like a Super Nintendo or a classic video game system, where instead of having the labor be from the first party that created it, there's actually a community of enthusiasts that are such fans of it that you might actually say that something like a Super Nintendo or a original Game Boy game may have greater longevity because of the social community around it that's writing emulators for whatever new ARM-based platform or whatever new kinds of CPU architecture that comes out. Because of their enthusiasm for the project, even against its intellectual property constraints, they will go out of their way to create the circumstances in which we can continue playing, Pokemon Yellow or whatever it is long into the future, as compared to something that is even maybe open source or much more open to this kind of being ported to future platforms. If it doesn't have the kind of social excitement around it, then it may fall into disrepair and just no longer be usable long in the future. If we think in a 25, 50, 100 or even 1,000-year future, I think it's possible that some of these things will stay relevant, but it will be by dint of the success of the performance art, not only by the people who created it, but by the whole community that's formed around it. So that's kind of what my research was about. And really fundamentally, what I was interested in was reading the activity that people like you or I, or the people listening to this recording are participating in is fundamentally an act of creating a kind of fashion of abstractions. And I prefer to think about computing that way and programming that way, because if we think of programming in terms of just writing, then we sort of lose the long history that will be forming, under our feet and into the future around computation that may look quite different. It would have been crazy to think of programming as a punch card art. So really, I think these different ways of talking about it may be a little bit poetic sometimes, but I think they cut to some truth, at least for me. That's a little bit deeper than where our heads can go if we're too stuck in the weeds of what programming looks like today. I'm not sure if I answered your second question.
No, it's fantastic, and it opens up all these possibilities. I think there's a point in there about work versus play and performance. And I think that in our current age, the distinctions are dissolving, or at least, I guess, the illustration that would signify some particular activity as this is serious, this is work stuff, this is your bank, it has marble arches and your money is safe here with the bankers, versus activity like these are cartoon avatars on Twitter and they're all, billionaires and they're playing money games with each other. Some of that scaffolding is just dissolving, and the distinctions between what it means to work and role play a particular type of person or particular type of activity, they're really becoming a lot more apparent. And I think the sort of like the technological underpinning of Web3 is doing that in part by rewarding people financially for participating in communities in a way that wasn't really possible in prior versions of the web. Anyway, that's me attempting a long wind up to connect the idea of network organisms to DAOs, to decentralized autonomous organizations, which is where a lot of your attention is today. Can you talk a little bit about how you think about DAOs, what it is that they are? What is the shape of these things? Are they just corporations on the internet? Are they just forums with crypto in it? Like, what are they?
Yeah, I think it's early days even for my understanding what a DAO is or can be. And I should preface all of this by saying, obviously nothing I say is financial advice, et cetera. But fundamentally, I think we don't have regulatory clarity around what new forms of organization that use blockchains as their fundamental substrate, how those will interact with the existing legal system. And I do think it's important. I don't think people should have to sacrifice their participation in the society we come from to be able to participate in some new forms of organization. So, frankly, I can't speak to it too much just because I don't have the answers yet, but that's an area of focus for me, which we can maybe get into a little bit later. But fundamentally, what a DAO is to me is people organizing for whatever their goal might be. I came into DAOs. My first DAO experience was PartyDAO. So I can give a brief summary of what PartyDAO is and how it came about. Essentially, there was a tweet, I believe by Dave White, or was it Dennis Nazarov from Mirror? I'm not sure who actually made the original tweet, but somebody proposed this idea on Twitter. What if we could collectively bid on NFT auctions? And Anish Agnihotri, colloquially referred to as the GOAT, the greatest of all time on Twitter, who's a very young and very, very talented programmer and now researcher at Paradigm. He basically took the charge up, as he is wont to do the past 6 months or a year that I've known him, and just took this tweet and just implemented it. And within about 12 hours or so, I think it was at 4 a.m., he posted an MVP GitHub repo with what he called PartyBid. And what PartyBid let you do was it was a Ethereum contract that you could create a party on and point it at an auction on the blockchain. And then anybody could contribute Ethereum to that party in order to collectively make a bid on an NFT. And it was used to win the Colin and Samir Mirror auction. Colin and Samir are a pair of YouTube creators who make content for other creators on the web. And they did a crowdfund using this Mirror crowdfunding platform, which if you look at it initially, it might look like a blog to you, but Mirror is it's a very cool platform that allows you to insert these crowdfund and NFT drop blocks. So essentially it's like almost like Medium, you might say, but if Medium also included embeddable contracts such as NFT drops or crowdfund. So Anish's party bid was used to win this NFT. And in very short order, Dennis and Anish and a handful of other people, John Palmer, sort of rallied around this idea of turning it into something longer lived, a software development organization, a decentralized organization. And we can talk a little bit about the meaning of the term DAO later, but they put up another crowdfund for what they called PartyDAO. So this would be a organization that would collect ETH in order to fund the development of a more professional, fully fleshed out and audited version of PartyBid, what would come to be called PartyBid V1. So they raised the funds. I was busy doing something else when they did this, and in a few hours, the fundraising was finished, and I wasn't even able to join in. But Anish was generous enough to share some of the resulting party tokens, which gave me and the rest of the people who had those tokens access to a Discord. So this is maybe an introduction to the idea of a token-gated Discord. Not necessarily a feature of a DAO, but a common feature of a DAO. So there'll be a collection of tokens, and if you hold those in your wallet, you can interact with the Collabland Discord bot in order to essentially associate your Discord account with your Ethereum wallet, thus granting you access to either all or some extra channels within the Discord conversation. So that was sort of my first experience of DAOs, and watching John Palmer and then Anish and Khalil, the lead designer of Uniswap, and Anna, who ended up being the Solidity developer and did a wonderful job on PartyBid V1. And Anisha worked on the front end and some of the infrastructure. Danny Aranda did communications. Many different people joined together, really an all-star cast of people who essentially, I think the main lesson from that early moment in PartyBid was a group of people who no corporation could ever have hired essentially for any amount of money. Nevertheless, came together in their spare time to work on this project, the mission of which was to create a piece of software that would allow minnows or small ETH holders to collect their funds in order to rival whales on Ethereum in purchasing of particularly interesting NFTs on on-chain auctions. So that was kind of my first experience of DAOs, and that led me down the rabbit hole a little bit. Yeah, that was the first step.
Yeah, so it's not a bad first step at all. Sort of a fantastic experience. Let's unpack the word decentralized, like you suggested. And I think decentralization is a point for a lot of debate, and I think it also means lots of different things to different people. You could have kind of a protocol that functions like Bitcoin or Ethereum, where decentralization might refer to the mining or validation structures. So lots of people securing the network, and it's mechanistic, and it's rule based. And then in other situations, things look a lot more like a cooperative or some sort of communal effort. And the decentralization refers to lots of people splattered all over the world, but there's not necessarily a mechanistic piece to it. So it can be really confusing when that word is used as a signal. How do you perceive it? What are the things that you think it implies? And, are there any philosophies that are attached to it that are meaningful for us?
Yeah, I think one of the first things that appealed to me about DAOs was, well, as I said, PartyDAO, for instance, was able to collect talent that really otherwise would never have joined together in order to create a piece of software for some centralized organization. So already from that story, we have a bit of a hint at what's interesting about DAOs, which is a different pattern of work. In the DAOs that I've been a part of, maybe PartyDAO a little bit less, but, and this is kind of the other thing, DAOs, it's really a whole ecology of possibilities, and the best practices are yet to be forged. And I would say that DAOs, a lot like NFTs, actually, people are a little bit too confident in when they talk about NFTs and saying that they are collectibles or they are a form of art or their relationship to the art market is sort of their ultimate destiny. Whereas as a programmer and someone with a kind of open heart, let's say, I really think NFTs are just a sort of a data structure. In a way, they're not even that, because you have NFTs that function completely differently on different blockchains. An NFT on Ethereum may conform to a certain standard, but an NFT on Tezos or I don't know, some other blockchain may have a completely different structure at the level of the code. So to me, what an NFT is, and I think this is interesting by way of analogy to DAOs, is an NFT is just a concept at the end of the day, and even a malleable one at that. If we look at NFTs for a moment, something like Unisocks, which is an interesting collection put out by Uniswap, where they created a token that could be exchanged for a pair of socks, which have since become quite valuable. I would say Unisocks are a part of NFT culture, even though if you look at the actual code and the nature of the token, they're not an NFT at all. They're a fungible token, not a non-fungible token. And so there's also this cultural element that can sort of make the boundaries between these things fuzzy. So to me, a DAO, some of the interesting things about DAOs are collecting resources from a group of people to accomplish some goal is a common feature. They may also collect human talent, individuals, maybe even before the majority of the financial or other assets are collected to compensate those people. And you use the word cooperative, and I think that's really where we're headed with DAOs. I think the most exciting moment will be when sort of community service and what some in the community call public goods, et cetera, initiatives discover this tooling. Because I think fundamentally what we are unearthing in the contract landscape of Ethereum and related blockchains is the possibility to create organizations where potentially permissionlessly people can collaborate with certainty about what kind of relationship they're getting into in some ways, but without necessarily involving a lawyer. So there's a lot in that. But essentially, what I would say is some of the things that I've seen that are interesting in DAOs are people working in multiple DAOs at the same time, not feeling this need to have like a singular direct relationship as they might in a traditional employment scheme with a corporation. Also, people sort of having a kind of zeal where the most impactful members of a DAO may not be at all the largest holders of whatever token represents membership of that DAO. Instead, participation, one thing I say about SharkDAO, which we can talk about in a moment, is SharkDAO is like DAO school. And I think the most valuable lessons we can take from DAOs today, especially these NFT related DAOs in the part of Ethereum that I spend the most time, is an education and forming relationships. And I would really suggest that anybody who's considering, participating in DAOs, participate in these things primarily as an educational and not to use a dirty word, but a networking opportunity to make relationships that I think can last decades, far more than any particular financial outcome. Because I think fundamentally, we really can't be sure what the financial outcomes are of any of these things.
That makes a lot of sense. I think it's an interesting set of attributes that have come together right now in Web3, where you have at the protocol level both in terms of the computational blockchain, but then one level up with the decentralized finance market infrastructure. You have this kind of hyper capitalistic property rights regime, which is maintained and enforced by code and math, and this Hobbesian world, a world that's built for resisting attack from some particular adversary. And then what's actually happening on top of this infrastructure with its property rights and its capital markets and its lending and all of these kind of very competitive things is people coming together to do things that are extremely aesthetic. They're beautiful both visually in some cases, but also just like as concepts, they're beautiful in their collaboration and in their participation. And so with that, I'd love to get an introduction to SharkDAO and maybe to NounsDAO and kind of like the concepts that are embedded into these different cooperatives.
Absolutely. So PartyDAO was my first experience, but I remain just a very small token holder. And as I was sort of exploring that and many other parts of the scene, I discovered this project, nouns.wtf is its website. And Nouns started as a tweet from a famous NFT collector called Punk4156, who is represented by a CryptoPunk, thus the name, an anonymous Twitter contributor who has quite a bit of influence in the NFT scene for their smart takes essentially on NFTs. And 4156 posted this idea. And then about 3 months later, 10 people, including 4156, published Nouns. And the Nouns is an NFT project that has some very interesting properties. To cut a long story short, Nouns are these, in my opinion, very cute, iconic creatures that are still images, NFTs represented by still images. And those images are composed of a bunch of properties, which are all stored on the blockchain. So 100% of the Nouns art is on the blockchain. And one noun is created per day. So every 24 hours, there's a new noun on auction. And for the majority of their history, they've actually been attracting quite a bit of attention and are selling for an average of around 200 Ethereum. So they're these cute, iconic creatures, and their visual data is stored entirely on the blockchain. So what that means is that there's no dependency off the blockchain. So as long as Ethereum is around, these nouns will be accessible to anybody who has access to Ethereum. And there's some other interesting properties about the project, a couple cool ones. It's a CC0, Creative Commons 0, which means that the art of nouns is completely reusable even for commercial purposes. So if you want to print any noun that has been minted or that you could imagine through recombination of those traits that are available on the blockchain, you can put it on a t-shirt and sell it, and you will require no permission to do so. So it's also an interesting project in terms of being one of the pioneers of this CC0 Creative Commons license. It sort of turns on its head the IP regime of Hello Kitty and Pokemon and the things that you might connect it to in the more traditional IP world. There's a couple other interesting things. The main one perhaps is that each noun is a governance token in the Nouns DAO. So the Nouns DAO collects the funds for each noun that is auctioned and sold every 24 hours or thereabouts. And this has so far created a very large treasury, not to date this episode, but I think the treasury is around 15,000 Ethereum right now. And so owning...
I think it probably begs a little bit of foreign exchange conversion here, right? So it's each noun is going for somewhere between $500,000 to a little bit over $1 million, I guess would be the range.
Somewhere around that, yeah.
And I'm not going to do the, you said it's 15,000 now, right? So
I just checked 14,000 Ethereum. Let me see.
Gotcha. So it's about
66 million. Yeah. And growing. So it grows by about 200 Ethereum or around $700,000 per day. And of course, that could change depending on the will of the market. But so far, people seem to be buying these things for around that price. So it's a very large treasury. And then if you own one of these nouns, you get to vote. Anybody can make a proposal. Any of the nouns holders can make a proposal. And then the rest of the noun holders can vote in the Nouns DAO. So that's the fundamental function of the Nouns DAO. It has this treasury, a lot of Ethereum, and each noun is the governance token, essentially a vote. So that's more or less the Nouns DAO. And maybe an interesting little feature is that the 10 people who collaborated to create the nouns call themselves the Nounders, yet another little piece of terminology. And the Nounders retain every 10th noun. So they took noun 0, noun 10, and so on. And so they have a large governance stake, which is also something that I don't know exactly how they do it, but together they decide how to vote. So that's basically what the Nouns project is. And it's a successful NFT project. And before Nouns launched on mainnet, a group of people who were quite enthusiastic about all of these features that I just described made an effort to collect nouns on the test network called Rinkeby. So Rinkeby is essentially exactly like Ethereum, except the money is more or less free, sort of a monopoly kind of money. And it's a place where developers and others can test what they're going to do eventually on the real Ethereum, what's called mainnet. You can test on testnet, and the most popular of the testnets is called Rinkeby. So the Nounders were testing their contract on this test network in advance of launching the real version, let's say. And some people decided that they wanted to collect the nouns that were being generated every day from this test version of the Nouns contract. And they actually put together 4 different versions of the contract on Rinkeby. So some people collected this Rinkeby Ethereum, which you can more or less get for free, but it requires that you send out a tweet. Anyway, the point is it's not totally easy to get this Ethereum. So they pooled their resources and collectively bid on the nouns on testnet and won a Shark Rinkeby noun. And then as nouns transitioned to their real official launch on mainnet, I was actually contacted by one of these early people. It was LDeFi Jesus on Twitter who contacted me because I was a part of PartyDAO. And he asked, could PartyDAO create an integration so that people could use this party bid product to collectively bid on the nouns? Because he felt quite strongly that the first noun that was publicly for sale should be owned by the community rather than some individual. And we talked a little bit, and unfortunately, the contract wasn't yet open source. They only open sourced the Nouns contract on the day of the launch, so it was impossible to write the integration between PartyBid and Nouns, even if we'd wanted to. But they went away, and a very large whale, a large Ethereum holder, actually won that first Noun for 613 ETH, I believe it was. And in the meantime, those people who had been collecting testnet Nouns found this protocol called Juicebox, which essentially allowed them to create what's called a Juicebox project, which is a treasury into which they were able to collect Ethereum from lots of different people. They offered to me to join in, but I didn't know what it was, and I didn't trust it at the time. So they collected a bunch of Ethereum and were able to win the second Noun, which is a pineapple as a head, called Pina, for something around 200 ETH. And they called themselves SharkDAO because they had won this Shark Noun on testnet. So that's the origin of the name of SharkDAO. And SharkDAO went on to continue using this Juicebox protocol to collect Ethereum and then regularly place bids on the Nouns that were going on auction every day. And up to this point, I believe we're still at 5 Nouns that SharkDAO has. The most recent of which was an actual shark Noun on mainnet. So Shark kind of fulfilled its mission and has finally acquired an actual shark on the real contract. And yeah, we can talk a little bit more about what Shark gets up to, but I thought it was a pretty cool story of how they came to be.
Yeah, the prophecy is fulfilled. That's fantastic. And it's just, there are some analogies to orthodox finance. There are analogies to how one could be putting together like a syndicate for a venture capital fund, or you can be thinking about shareholding in some particular company. But again, this space brings with it a sense of play and a sense of adventure and a sense of aesthetic. And so you're interacting and bidding on, and really like the whole world is colored by these really cute pixelated characters, when in fact they are $500,000 checks into what is a balance sheet for likely building new types of Web3 products and other things of that nature. And I guess the question I'd have about these balance sheets, and I think we can take this through the lens of Juicebox or through the lens of SharkDAO, whatever makes most sense, is, what are these treasuries for? Like, this is how the funds are being raised, but it's not merely kind of an aesthetic experience where you think that the image is worth something. What is it that people are buying? And then how is it that whatever is being bought instantiates in the real world? Like how are people making the things that I guess the original purchasers expect there to be?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think we're at a very experimental moment, and some people have come into projects like Shark or Nouns expecting that this is some kind of financial relationship, and certainly DAO technology does maybe in the future allow for something like that. But at the same time, we're in this very experimental moment, and Shark has been very careful when explaining what it is, and you can check it out. I believe it's sharkdao.community is the website. But there's no clear way that anybody who purchases the tokens, essentially by making a donation, a contribution to SharkDAO for its future projects, there's no clear way in which you could make money from that, aside from perhaps selling it on Uniswap or moving the tokens around themselves. There's no clear way in which someone who participates in the community can realize some kind of financial return. And certainly the DAO would never make such promises. And I think that the same thing is probably true for Nouns DAO. It's not clear what the exact relationship is between a financial contribution and even involvement in the future. What is the purpose of these DAOs? One point of contrast we can draw is perhaps with PartyDAO, where PartyDAO, there was this blog post and a fundraiser for under 30 Ethereum, so tens of thousands of dollars essentially. And very quickly that transitioned into there being a mission statement that was proposed and ratified by the holders of the token that PartyDAO would try to make software such as PartyBid and perhaps other software in the future that would be relevant to the NFT community. I don't know that Nouns or Shark have had such a clear mission, but instead have been sort of social experiments. So I think Nouns, with their enormous treasury, I'm not sure that they were entirely planning to have such a huge treasury, or if they thought that far. But I think they're sort of orienting themselves increasingly toward funding public goods and funding other projects that just create and enrich the fun ecosystem that is this Nouns project. And they're sort of still figuring it out as a group, I think some people sometimes joke about, in their Twitter bio, they'll put that they're the CEO of some DAO. It's important to understand that this is a joke because there is no CEO of these things. And whatever the voting mechanism is, for instance, in the Nouns DAO holding nouns, that will be the mechanism by which the future of this treasury and this collective action will be decided. So we can obviously see that there's going to be a lot of interesting potential for things like co-ops that have a more explicit mission from the outset. But I think we're in a stage of Web3 development where people are very exuberant and excited and optimistic. And, of course, that won't last. And Web3 itself is not going to deliver us a utopia. It will deliver us new tools that will perhaps operate differently than the traditional tools we're used to. But there will be good and bad that come with that, undoubtedly. So I think for SharkDAO, for instance, I think, as I say, it's like the best thing about SharkDAO to me has been meeting all the other people who are extremely active in organizing and making proposals. I was lucky enough to collaborate with DropNerd, one of the people who's organizing SharkDAO for the past few months quite a bit in helping to write the mission statement for SharkDAO. What we ended up sort of coming to and was ultimately unanimously adopted by the community was that what Shark should be focused on is creating Web3 experiences that are fun for its members, but also really for the whole community, and that's where the greatest opportunity was for everybody involved. So, I think one thing we have this sort of strange example of Nouns and Shark. Shark has a much smaller treasury than the Nouns DAO, of course. And I'm just looking at the numbers now. There are, at least in the Discord, which is not a full representation, but in the Discord, there are 3,500 people who are in the Shark DAO Discord, and 750 people of those who have associated their wallet and proved that they hold Shark tokens. So we could say there's 750 sharks in the SharkDAO Discord, which far outstrips the 101 nouns that have been created so far. So the Nouns DAO is a much smaller community. And so they have different strength. So for SharkDAO, for instance, that means that there's a huge number of people who are, in general, I'd say, have less wealth than the people who are able to afford these $1 million nouns. And they're very excited about NFTs and what the potential of this scene is. And so they're a captive audience, really excited about new derivative projects that turn the nouns art into new forms of NFTs or other kinds of projects. They're excited to purchase or advise or be involved in the development of these new projects. And in general, to spread the word about how cool Nouns is and how many interesting people they're meeting around this social happening that is the SharkDAO community. So it's very open-ended, I would say, and it really depends on the specific DAO what actually happens there.
Yeah, I think that's really fascinating. And like in the discussion of decentralization, there are some things that are really well, I guess, identified and quantified. And then there are some things which are just part of the human animal and how people come together, right? So for something like Juicebox, there are clear programmatic money flows between a treasury and particular use cases, and it in many ways resembles like a payment processor or a business to business cash management fintech software that's there to like automate flows between particular uses and particular sources of capital. And then in other things like how do people organize and how do they decide to do things, it's much more political and it's much more communal and sort of participatory and I guess performative also. And this gets to, I guess it gets us to loop back to the idea of the creator economy where the NFTs aren't just some digital object to own and the ownership is the point. That's not necessarily why people are joining DAOs and paying the ticket price. Rather, it's an identification of your tribe, and it's kind of it's almost a hazing ritual for you to pay the price to belong to a group and then to express the values of that group. And of course, that's super interesting once you factor in that nouns are in the Creative Commons and that a nested DAO in the Nouns DAO is able to use that IP and to represent it and to build projects off of it. And so I wanted to use that as a prompt to talk about how you think about where the creator economy is going in terms of intersecting with NFTs, and maybe a little bit about your work with artists and photographers and other folks who are doing the thing that Shark is focused on. So making the beautiful things or making the fun things. How do you see that interacting with, with smart contracts and some of the more deterministic systems that are required to be built. Sorry, the question's rambling on, but I guess it is this prompt around the creator economy and what you're doing to work with artists.
Got you. Yeah. So I think there's two interesting things here. One about Juicebox and one about some of the collaborations I do. So recently, I put out a contract with a photographer named Monaris, who's a well-known street photographer. We worked together on a collection she had put together called NYC Underground Stories, which is a selection of 51 photographs she took in the New York City subway. And she had previously created NFTs using some of the more well-known platforms and had a great experience and sold out, as far as I know, all of her NFTs. And there was a excited collector community around her. And she decided that it would be interesting to have her own contract. So essentially, many of the creator platforms right now for NFTs, and this will be changing in the future, but at least at present, they allow you to create NFTs using a easy-to-use web interface. But for the most part, they place all of the NFTs into the same collection, the same contract in the same collection. So if you're to look them up on OpenSea, which is sort of the eBay of NFTs, you can see all of the NFTs, but there's no differentiation between your NFTs and my NFTs if we create them using the same platform for the most part. And this is an evolving story. So there are reasons why you might want your collection, especially if you're an established artist, to be separated from other people's so that it have its own space and hold its own space. But also you might design the contract to have its own affordances that are particularly well suited to the exact kind of project you're trying to create. So in the case of Monaris's NYC Underground Stories project, she knew in advance all of the photographs that she wanted to create. And so we could strip out some parts of other contracts where they would need affordances for creating NFTs over time, and instead just mint the entire collection at deploy time, at the initial launch of the collection. And so I wrote that contract for her, and I think it was a good experience. NFTs have a lot of interesting potential. One thing that's really cool about them is that artists can declare the percentage royalties they would like from the secondary market, which is really something that traditional art is never allowed. And so on her contract, when somebody resells one of her artworks, she'll be taking a small percentage of it to support her art making in the future. And in general, I think it's very promising that all of the marketplaces that I'm aware of are supportive of this royalties mechanism. And while there are ways that you could bypass it if you are the marketplace and not honor the royalties scheme, all of them that I know of have chosen to do so. And even in the history of NFTs, there was in fact a sort of collective movement among artists a couple of years ago to ensure that platforms like Super Rare and Foundation and OpenSea, et cetera, hear the voices of the artists and respect those royalties. And ultimately, it was successful. And the platforms, I believe it was Super Rare that they were talking with at the time, Super Rare and platforms to launch subsequently have continued to honor those royalties. So I think there's a really interesting movement for creators, not only specifically in terms of royalties, but just in general in terms of the weight that they can carry in the ecosystem right now. So it's important that we establish the right social conditions for creators today so that we don't end up in the same kind of circumstance we have where if you swear on YouTube, you won't be found in search results anymore or something like this. And the ways that I often think about, like Facebook, if Facebook had been from another part of the world that perhaps had different mores around the human body or sexuality, perhaps we would have different kinds of content available on Instagram than we do given the sort of context in which Facebook grew up. So there's a lot of things going on. And I think Juicebox, just to explain a little bit about Juicebox, so SharkDAO used Juicebox as a fundraising mechanism, a treasury. And what Juicebox, sometimes I talk about it like a DAO treasury protocol. And sometimes I talk about it sort of like a decentralized Kickstarter. You can sort of think of it like. So fundamentally what Juicebox lets you do is to fulfill one of the two fundamental obligations of a DAO, at least as I see it so far. So to me, a DAO has two major functions. One is often collecting some kind of assets. That could be NFTs or Ethereum or some other token. And the second function is governing that treasury. So Juicebox handles the treasury piece. And then there's many other things that we can plug in that are composable on the blockchain, on Ethereum specifically, for handling that governance piece. And so some ways that this can be done are either, I think it would be helpful for the audience to understand how a DAO actually functions. So in general, a DAO is composed of some set of tokens, and Juicebox will let you issue those tokens in response to a contribution. So I'll set up a Juicebox project. Let's say we want to set one up for this podcast, and we say we're going to create a decentralized podcast where the community can vote on who comes onto the show next. And so we'll do a fundraising phase where we create a Juicebox project. People can make contributions, and in exchange, they earn tokens, which can be issued at the exchange rate that you or whoever is managing the project can set up initially. And then those tokens can be used in a governance function later on to vote on proposals. And so the most common way that that's done is using a pair of tools. One is a Gnosis multisig. So a multisig is fundamentally just a contract that can hold on to some asset and execute some transactions. So in the case of Juicebox, a multisig would be the owner of the Juicebox project, perhaps. And this allows us to have multiple people controlling the parameters for fundraising so that no individual can go rogue and change the parameters and do something bad. So for instance, if we were to do one for this podcast, we might create a Juicebox treasury, the ownership of which is represented by the person who holds the Juicebox's project's NFT. And then we would pass that NFT into a Gnosis multisig, which could then administer the Juicebox project essentially. And then we would use a third piece of infrastructure called Snapshot, which is an off-chain voting tool to essentially make proposals, which are just text documents that lay out what the proposal is and give a couple single choice amongst multiple options in a voting mechanism. And then anybody who holds that token that represents partial ownership of the podcast's treasury could vote on Snapshot for which result they prefer. So say who the next guest is, they could vote yes or no if you make a proposal. So that's one way to do a DAO. And another way might be to replace that Gnosis and Snapshot piece that I mentioned with something that's more on-chain. So in this case, everything would be done on the blockchain, and there would be no aspect that happens just in your web browser. Instead, absolutely everything would be executed as a transaction on the blockchain. And this makes it more fully decentralized in some sense, but also a little bit less agile and quite a bit more expensive to interact with. So I've mentioned a lot of projects, but I think the takeaway for the listener could be something like we're in an ecosystem of DAO tooling. And Juicebox is one of those tools. Gnosis, Snapshot, Aragon would be an on-chain alternative to those. Are all these composable tools that can be mixed and matched with each other in order to create all of the infrastructure that is a single DAO. And each DAO will make different choices about which pieces of tooling and which level of decentralization is appropriate for their application. So that's sort of the emerging scene in which I'm spending a lot of my time.
That's fantastic. And I would love to spend another hour or two on these topics, and I hopefully will have a follow-up where we can do that. But for today, we got to wrap it up, and I want to ask you, where should people go to learn more about you as well as the different projects that you're involved in?
Absolutely. So I spend most of my time on Twitter, so you can come find me there. My name is Nicholas with 4 leading N's, so NN. Nicholas with an H. And I have a little purple icon to make sure it's me. I also spend a lot of my time helping out at the Juicebox DAO, building the Juicebox protocol. And the website for that is juicebox.money. And you can take a look on Twitter for SharkDAO and PartyDAO and all these other projects. If you'd like to check out the NFT project I worked on, you can look on OpenSea. It's called NYC Underground Stories. And I look forward to seeing you on Twitter. Feel free to say hello.
It was a real treat to have you on the podcast. Thank you for sharing the story and giving us a view into this fascinating space.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. That's it for this week's episode of the FinTech Blueprint. For more technical deep dives into all things fintech and decentralized finance, check out fintechblueprint.com and grab a free subscription to the newsletter. This is Lex, and I'll see you next time.